Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. So today this is our last session for this particular course, Culturally Responsive Built Environments. What I am going to do is I am going to take you the whole journey, how we started and what are the phases we have undergone and what are the topics we have dealt, and as a concrete understanding what kind of understanding we are taking away home. So that is what I am going to brief you out in this particular session. In fact, the very base structure of our course, Culturally Responsive Built Environments. There are basically 8 weeks course and each week has dealt with one module. So the first module talks about introduction to terminology and theory, and because that is where a student gets familiarizes with what is the definitions of a place, what is a space, and all this jargon of this kind of terminology, what is vernacular architecture, what is the new vernacular, all these aspects of it. So that gives a very brief introduction of, at the same time, a little introduction to the in-depth theories of the sociological theories. So that creates a good understanding for the student, so to understand what is a place and space. And the second one, we talked about how the different scales and dimensions. In fact, when we talk about culturally responsive built environments, here we have talked about from an object, a room, an interior, a dwelling, and we can even talked about a public place. We talked about even the whole Madura as a landscape, right, and the Vrindavan. So how basically the whole bigger landscape also comes within the umbrella of culturally responsive built environments. And in the second module, we also discussed about how different dimensions, how different perspectives, how one can understand culture. It introduces the anthropological dimension, it introduces the landscape dimension, so like that it discusses the various dimensions. The third aspect, which is specifically on power and religion, which actually and also a part of ethnicity, we discuss about how they influence the spatial forms. In the fourth module, we discussed about the components of culture and risk, especially with the case of disaster risk, climate change adaptation, and the relocation context. And in the fifth module, it covers on the conservation and the heritage aspects of culturally responsive built environments. And the sixth aspects, we cover planning with culture and planning for culture. So how the planning strategies accommodate, try to integrate cultural dimension. The seventh aspect come to material resources, technology, and how they are integrated within the cultural dimension. And the last one, because after discussing about the various of scales, dimensions, and various dimensions of power, conservation, planning aspects into it, and the material dimension, that is where we come with the social change, especially with the Indian context. We talked about Sanskritization, the westernization, and the modernization, the globalization, and at the same time we bring a parallel of how the education also enables you to understand, or at the same time disables you to understand how it actually have a control, because in the present digital age, what are the ways one is not able to and one is able to understand culture. So that aspect is also covered in that, and this is the final lecture, and this is the skeleton of our course. This is how a course has been framed as the initial level. And as I said, how this journey have started. This is not a course which I just thought of delivering a course just for the sake of any course. It is my journey starting from a bachelor's course, via masters and through some practice and through some research. So working in different countries, different places, different climates, learning climates and cultures. So this is how my whole journey of about from 2002 onwards until to date, I try to summarize in a form of a course. That is where culturally responsive built environments came through. In fact, many people have misunderstood my expertise. Some have, because of my qualification, they understood that I am a vernacular architecture expert, and some people, because of my PhD topic, they understood I worked on a disaster context, and some people, because I worked with an urban design aspects in Sweden, that is where they understood he has some urban. So, but the fundamental thing was, whatever the scale I was looking into, the underlying dimension is the cultural dimension, how it operates at a small room to a big city. That scale is open. And in fact, my journey in 2002, when I looked at this photograph of Latur earthquake rehabilitation, which was in 1993 in Marathwada region, and you can see a number of houses even today they are unoccupied. That is the first question in my mind, how and why they are unoccupied. That is where the cultural dimension came into my journey, and that is where I started looking at it and framing it, trying to understand each and every bit of it. Even now, I cannot say I have understood, but I'm still in the process of understanding culture. That's why even my PhD title, I try to say understanding the role of culture, because that is where I'm providing a way, an opportunity and a method how to understand a culture. So in the module 1, there are 5 lectures. First lecture talks about a place. In fact, we started with the Grimm's Pound. What you can see here is a kind of Grimm's Pound it's referred as a kind of survival instinct. It's a territorial instinct. So there's a boundary defined for a particular community. And we also discussed that, especially the Castaway, Tom Hanks story, how important to have your being in a place and how you associate, how an individual becomes a social individual, even without your other fellow beings. So that is where the story of Wilson and Tom Hanks, where we talk about places cannot exist without us, but equally important, we cannot exist without places. So there is something where that communication process, the perception process do exist. That is where your representation or your understanding of that whole process. And it is a social construct. Place is a social, we engage actively, and we make places that we live in. It might range from a room to a size of a continent. And that is where, when many debates we discussed about how a place and space are debated, the debate between the modernism and the postmodernism, because the modernist always talks about the priority of space, how it is well ordered space, how it is a highly institutionalized space, but whereas the postmodernist talks about the primacy of place and how especially the lived space. So in the second lecture, we talked about the identity. We brought the place and identity. We discussed about my mother's perception of how a small goddess in North India and South India, how her perception was different, and how her attachment to the temple and religion and that particular place has made worth because of science and the symbolic attachment. So that is where we also talked about how a sense of place is also developed in defining oneself in opposition to the other. The case of Babri Masjid, we talked about how, whether it is a Ram Janmabhoomi or it is a Babri Masjid, so it's basically some certain representations we try to oppose one another, and how the marriage and the ethnic origins, how the marriage practices also define the form of a settlement. In fact, in the African tribes, where the polygamous cultures and the monogamous culture, how it orients the space and disorients the space. And similarly in Nicosia, where we talk about the conflicted cities. So that is where you have the TNRC and you have the Greek part of Cyprus, and how they are divided. The same city is divided by that is where we once have to look back into the historic roots of why Cyprus got divided. And and the Dogon tribes, how the spirituality, how the spiritual senses, how the indigenous knowledge of their calculations, of the astronomical calculations, as well as how they celebrate their dances to frighten the evil spirits and things like that. So that is where, it's this whole processes of defining oneself in the opposition of other, and defining your sense, making a sense of a place through memories, to enactments, to, in fact, the moment we are talking about Nicosia, on obviously people who came from different places, and whenever they travel, that is where you are taking the traces of what you already know, and you try to implement it. So your body is moving, and your mind, your body is the vehicle, but your mind is the engine to it. So that is how you look at it. That's where we talked about Martin Heidegger's concepts, body, being, and time, and how it travels, how your body travels, and how your mind interacts with the outer world, and how it takes its known world to the other places. And that is how a sense of place is created. And then we also, the third lecture, we talked about the habitus, a sense of place. We introduced you to the Bourdieu's work, especially the fields and games, and that's how it talks about the theory which connects the culture, structure, and the agency, the power. And here we also have talked about how Bourdieu's work has been reflected in the built environment studies, especially from the Kim Doville's work, on how habitus comprises forms of habit, and because the repeated encounters and of habitat. So like that, the habitus is a subject to change, but such revisions are always based on existing social practices, which the habitat may change radically, and the habitat evolves. So the moment we are talking about habitus, change is the crucial factor, and how it involves and how it evolves with that process. And finally, we started from place. We started our journey, and then we reached the home in lecture 4. That is where we brought Amos Rappaport understanding of vernacular house form and culture, and vernacular architecture, and how he classifies the folk traditions into primitive and pre-industrial, and the high style or modern vernacular. And similarly, we taken down from 1969 to even the Paul Oliver's definition of 1997, what vernacular architecture is and what it comprises of. The last one, because till that point we were talking about the basic understanding of vernacular architecture, but what happens, how we can take it to a bigger level in a present context, and that is where how it changed, how gradually it has evolved. That is where the pattern books, how the because without tradition there can be no longer be reliance on any accepted norms, and there is a beginning of institutionalization. That is where the patterns started emerging. The Spanish colonies in Manila, and they established some patterns into it. So that is, till that point, the tradition has become a kind of control and regulator. And here, when you actually, the lack of cooperation leads to the introduction of controls as codes, regulations concerning alignments and setbacks. So, and you can see in the Chiang Mai's context how they gel with each other, the modern constructions, and how there is a kind of a reflection of the traditional forms, and how there is a mediation between the old and new. So this is what the theory component, which at least the student got familiar about, from a place to home, and then what is the vernacular architecture, and what is the and how the new vernacular has also been understood. In the second module, we talked about understanding vernacular or towards anthropology. So that is where we talked about the transformation of Thai house, how to study a building and a place in a chronological order, in a whose perspective it is. Like we talked about tribes in Madhya Pradesh. By looking at the symbol, one can understand that it is a Hindu, but it is not, because there's other reasons behind it, how the local spiritual agencies have portrayed some kind of evil stories, and then so the reasons behind it, what we see on a photograph, what we see, and what the reasons behind it would be different. That is where anthropology goes beyond the depths of it, beyond the surfaces, and it looks at the underlying aspects. So one needs to understand. So even in the charms case of in the Southeast Asia, where we believe that vernacular architecture is more of a climatic orientation, but in Cham's case it is not true. And the second module, we have the lecture 7, where we talked about the geotechnical aspects, especially in the study of Pitalkhora caves, and how one can understand the historic dimension where the geotechnical aspect is very relevant in understanding and conservation of these particular structures. So when we talk about the culture, history is very important, but history alone cannot make it better. You need to understand the technical aspect of it and how to protect it, how to protect our past and how to preserve our past and how to continue and how to share with our future generations. And in the lecture number 8, we talked about we improved the scale. We started our scale from anthropology at the shelter level, and we improved the scale at almost the whole landscape, the sacred landscape level, where we discussed about Devaprayag, we talked about the sacred natural sites, and we also talked about Brindavan, especially Amita Sinha's work, and that is where the ecological and the sacred dimensions work, and how the enactments, how people interact with the landscape, and that is where the imagined landscape, picture as a space, is drawn from the real landscape, space as a picture, is in turn guides in revealing the reciprocity between representation and physical reality. So, how a person interacts with all these myths and how they have been transferred from one generation to another generation, and the place offers. One can learn from it, one can interact with that through the process of circumvention, through process of his interaction with that environment. And then here I brought the climatic dimension, though I would have brought different climatic conditions, but I know there is a lot of literature on the tropical climates and the Mediterranean and other climates, but I thought of bringing where I personally had my experience in living there. So at least one sort of climate could give you a better idea, even a climatic dimension. Winter climates. What is a winter kind of landscape, winter landscape and urbanism? So we discussed how the protective environments becomes active winter environments, how they are welcoming winter today. So from the Ralph Screen's work of protective environment, how a barrier becomes path and path becomes barrier when the season changes, And this is we discussed in the context of Nordic countries. And within the same context, as an extension, we also brought the accessibility dimension, because that is where we talk about diversity of people, and we have to discuss about the design for all approach, the accessibility dimension, the barrier-free dimension into it. And here we showed you about our students' work on how they integrated on the maintenance aspect into the urban environments. The study of urban environments, so how the maintenance also has to be brought, the operational aspect into it, the climatic aspect into it, and as well as the socio-cultural aspect into it. So that is what we discussed in this particular module. And in the third module, we talked about the power, religion, and built form. So where the hegemonic structures, how the power had translated into the built form, especially we referred with the Dovi's work, and as well as we try to learn the get introduction of spatial analysis, space syntax tools of gamma analysis. And in this lecture we talked about what are the force, forms of power over and power to, and what are the various aspects of that power: force, coercion, seduction, authority, and we discussed the case of Taksim Square and Vatican City, a variety of cases as an examples which we studied through. And then before getting into gamma analysis, we discussed about the space syntax tools of the basic introductions of how one can assess these built forms, especially in the study of Hitler's contributions and during the Hitler's era, and how a power has been understood and how it has been laid out in the series of spaces, and how a space syntax is used to understand the power relationships with the built form. So similarly, we also talked about the forbidden space in China in the Asian context, and how this whole process, the story of the forbidden space, how it becomes a kind of liberation space, and in turn again it becomes a forbidden space at some point. So how the forbidden concept has interchanged. So if you look at it, before China has got this kind of political revolution, the other side of it is a forbidden space, and this was an open space. But during the revolution, this is open and this is a kind of forbidden. So that is how place has got interchanged through power. When the power changes, obviously the space patterns change. We also talked about power, religion, and built form in our 14th lecture, where we talked about the Ator of Dead in the Mexican way of how they celebrate these places, how even the death also how it connects people, right? At the same time, various religious functions in Nepal, we studied the Bhaktipur, and the Srirangam we have studied, how this religion plays an important role in the urban fabric, in the society, in their lives. And in the 15th lecture, we talked about construction workers' housing, bringing one of my students' work of Venkatesh work, where here, even the ethnicity plays well, a very an important role, how they are accommodated and how they work with the project dynamics and what kind of vulnerable situations they are into it. So that is all have discussed, and it shows a methodology how it has an implication on the policy level implications, the design level implications, and an operational level implications. And the fourth module, we talk about culture and risk, and that is where I introduce my own work about what kind of framework I have developed and the basic theory behind the disasters and development. And how I applied that framework in the study of post-tsunami reconstruction and as a response. Obviously, not only during my doctoral studies, but later on after 8 years, we again visited and see the adaptation process and try to document that. And it was really astonishing to see how people have modified their houses, and unimaginable how this small co-dwelling has become a livable dwelling. And various methods we talked about it, and the build back better approaches, various issues in the allocation process, various issues in the layouts, in the design aspects of it. And we also discussed about, in an urban context, especially in the Kiruna case, how the whole mining town has been relocated, and what happens to the heritage, what happens to the cultural heritage, what are the issues within it, what are the operational issues involved in it, what are the planning complexities involved in it, and what are the various solutions one had to talk about, and what are the feasibilities within it. So this is all a cultural point of view, we have discussed that. And then we also have discussed about how to understand the cultural context in disasters and development, because we also talked about the Ghibellina case in Sicily and how the whole investment has gone haywire, and now you can see the emptiness. Not many people, there's a whole much of investment has been wasted. On one side, the investment has wasted and not much of life, it's becoming a very dull environment. And here in the Hudhud cyclone case, where we talk about hardly any investment in the rebuilding the lives, but how people are struggling in the present conditions. So we tried to discuss how not to rebuild. And then improving the scale of it, because when we talk about the culture and risk, especially we need to talk from the anthropological point of it, especially with the climate change, which is much more macro level understanding, and how we are unable to integrate the climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So this is where I brought one of my professors' work, Regina Lim's work, in understanding the Philippines' cultural identity, and how the sea cultures as well as the mountain cultures, how their myths are meant for a sustainable practices, and what is happening with the present systems, and how the due respect is gradually diminishing. That is where we also talked about my present ongoing work of what kind of framework brought, how to integrate different spatial scales, different knowledge gaps, how to bring temporal scales, so how we can address all these mismatches in a one simple framework. And the fifth module, we introduce us with the conservation. So from here onwards, I tried to show you in one slide. The previous slides I showed you every lesson in one slide, so that it gives a kind of a format how you can recapitulate each and every lesson. But the half of it I showed it you, the rest half of it I'll show you in a summary of the module, and so that you can practice in home how you can actually put each lecture in one small sheet, one single sheet. So that will help you in the preparation of examinations. Here we talked a variety of issues, starting from the basic definitions of conservation related terms like heritage, world heritage, the principles of conservation, and we also talked about various charters, Burra Charter, Washington, the various charters, NARA documents, and we also talked about some very good examples of how it's not only the built heritage, how the natural heritage is also part of it. And we talked about the intangible heritages, how even the language, even the songs, how they could be part of these precious heritage of one's community. Not only that, in food, the Kyoto's food. So like that, we talked about buffer zones, the core zones, and what are the ways to restore it, and how to understand the historicity of a place. All these aspects we did discussed about in the conservation module, how to protect our natural and cultural heritage. And the sixth module, we talk about planning with and for culture. So where we introduce with good case studies of city Hridai plan of Badami in Indian context, how different schemes are working out and what are the methodology they have adopted and what are the challenges involved. And similarly, we also brought you some information on internationally the London cultural strategy, Hamilton strategies plan, the cultural plans in international case studies, and how one can identify the cultural assets, how to program it, how to understand it. And in the Middle Eastern component, we also talked about Doha, how Doha has transformed from 1950 as a small fishing village to a big metropolis, and how this particular place, what are the associated factors for these changes. And with this, what we have learned is what is the importance of culture and what is the importance of theory in it, to understand especially the Henry Lefebvre's work on how he tried to relate with the transformation of Doha, and how the theory is very relevant in understanding the Doha transformation. So, and the last two lectures, which have focused more on the informal sector, that is where we brought Canadian Institute's work, especially Aranya work in B.V. Doshi's work, as well as the design experiments which they have conducted as a team, and what kind of ways they have shown us to understand these particular informal settlements. And that is where we also talked about the Motiakan settlements as well. And in the sixth module, we talked about the material resources and technology and culture. So it's much more coming to the micro level conditions, what are the stone as a vernacular building resource, timber as a building resource, and as well as I also discussed about advanced building frame technologies. And as a teacher, how we teach our students, especially in the vernacular architecture studios, and what are the ways one can engage our students so that they learn better. So those kind of thumb rules we have discussed about it. And on the last lecture in this material resource, we talked about architecture without architects. That is where Bernard Rudowski's work, where we have to consider nature. We have to understand first nature before understanding culture. And the last module, which talks about social change in India, which was defined in 3 lectures. The first stage talks about the Sanskritization, the second stage talks about the westernization, the third stage brings about modernization and globalization. And after this, the students are familiar with the kind of change, the whole process, what we discuss is a change. At the end, I brought the education, the pluralism in built environment education, how with this kind of change, how it affects the dissonance effects in the digital dissonance effects in the architectural education, how the cognitive and affective and the psychomotor skills are contributing to one's knowledge and how it is affected in the present context. So that is where we discussed about the education component as well. And finally, this is a kind of summary of culturally responsive built environments. So I hope you all had a good time, but now what is the takeaway from this? I just have drafted a few points, putting all the lectures in one go and what we learned together. So some conclusions and questions. One of the important sentences which I tried to frame was, a built environment is never complete without culture, and such environments are better understood only if one understands its underlying cultural determinants. So you talk about Tom Hanks' story. If you want to talk about his understanding of his built environment, there is nothing built anything there, but even small Wilson became his wife, his everything, you know. So a small football has something to bring his bigger world into it, right? So that's what I'm saying. A built environment is never complete without culture. And a culturally responsive built environment, it exists in different scales. It could be a form of an object. It could be an objectified form as Bourdieu refers it. It could be a small art piece, but it can be even handled the way we discussed the toko in Japan, tokonama in Japan, where a small room space, a corner of a room is a sacred space in it. And to the size of a continent, we talk about, you know, the culture is represented in a small object to a small room, to a city, to a state, to a country, to a continent. And not only the continent, even the route, the Silk Route, the spice route, which connects all these continents, also could be understood as a part of the culturally responsive built environments. It is a humanized landscape which is evolved, transformed, modified, adjusted through an effective response to constant changes that are encountered within and out of its place-time context. It is defined through a matrix of different structures that create identity. They include family, kinship, gender, ethnicity, religion, politics, power, history, ecological nature, socio-cultural interaction, legal aspects that define, control, change, manage, and even at times destroy the setting of its built forms, people's behavior patterns, and ethical practices. So that is a brief understanding what we actually summarized. But now how to learn, as students, how to learn and understand culturally responsive built environment. I will talk about a few thumb rules which you can consider it for your future learning. The first principle, if you want to understand, learn to unlearn. Especially when you are dealing with the remote areas, when village cultures, rural developments, try to learn, how to unlearn. Because you are going with a very pre-decided mindset. This is what a development means for. Today, a girl came to me and she talks, they were all very underdeveloped. She was going in a tribe and working in a tribe. But because the moment she is talking about underdeveloped, because she is coming from a different platform, for her the development is different. But where the tribe, they are self-sustainable. They grow their paddy, they are not depending even on the market. So the moment we are talking about the sustainability aspect, their definitions are very different. So we need to unlearn these pre-decided aspects, determinants. First, understand and experience the nature and its setting before understanding culture. If you want to understand a culture, understand its nature first. What are the ecology? What is its ecology? What is its patterns? What is its slope? What is the climate? You obviously result into culture. Your understanding take you to culture. As environments were thought before they were built. As this was Amos Rappaport points out this aspect. Built environments were thought before they were built. Each cultural environment is unique by its nature. What you see in Ghana is different, what you see in Turkey is different, what you see in Andaman is very different. At the same time, identify and relate the similarities and contrast how different cultures operate, negotiate, and mediate for their existence and survival in time and place. It still offers learning. See, though it is unique culture, but is there somewhere where we can relate to other cultures? That is where we can cross exchange certain learnings from one culture to another culture. Define the perspective to understand the limits and focus. Are you looking from an anthropologist perspective? Are you looking from a sociologist perspective? Are you looking from a built environment perspective? What is your perspective into it? What is your focus? So you have to be clear on that. That will limit your focus and it will say what is your limitation. At the same time, acknowledge, collaborate and cooperate from different inter and transdisciplinary domains of knowledge, including anthropology, cultural geography, semiotics, art, architecture, sociology, politics, engineering, technology and management as well. So this is where if you want to bring that perspective, you should be very clear what actually you are looking for. If you know what you are looking for, then identify the appropriate path and pick the right tools and methods to understand, experiment and analyze. I did discuss with you many times of how I use the mental maps in different contexts in different ways, right, because of the context. So you need to understand that context very much and what exactly you want to get from them. So what tools could be more appropriate? One need to focus not just on short-term adaptations, but it is relevant to think about medium and long-term adaptations and adjustments. So then only you can understand culture better. Like in my case, it took me 10 years to understand what happens in the tsunami reconstruction and how people have adapted. To understand it took me 10 years. Even to frame this course, it took me more than 15, 16 years. So that is how one need to have when you are as an architect, you are designing any particular settlement for future, you are designing for future, the present and the future, but you have to connect the past. But when you are designing the future, you need to keep in mind that what is the scope for adaptation, what is the feasibility you are giving them to adapt, and what cost you are giving that. Like in Gibellina case, they have exaggerated the whole feasibility. So that is where the failure came. In the most cases, there is need for paradigm shift from a singular vision to shared vision approach. So earlier it was an architect who was deciding everything, but now you have to consider the user group. Who are the users? Who are the active stakeholders into it? Which can be an effective tool for addressing diverse needs, challenges and possibilities, to explore the possibilities also. One need to practice by engaging themselves to understand better the dynamics of culturally responsive built environments. So you need to engage yourself in order to, it's not like you understand a formula and you can assess a culture. You need to engage with that community. You need to go and experience that particular aspect of it. Then only you can better understand that culture. So this is a very brief summary, but bringing back my same modules, what actually we learned. The first module I brought in the same template, but let's see how each module we have learned. Number one, it is very important that we should understand the theoretical underpinning and advancements, how they are contributing the cultural discourse of the built environments. Because theory is always advanced, and the practice follows upon it. And theory learns from also practice, and it frames a theory. So it is very important one has to understand the theoretical understanding. In the second module, culture exists in different scales and can be understood from different domains and perceptions. We brought anthropology, we brought sociology, we brought landscape dimension, we brought the scale of a landscape to a small house. In power, when power or the religion changes, it is reflected in the spatial changes. When something changes here, something changes here as well. It might reverse. Risk can be better dealt in the fourth module of culture and risk. Risk can be better dealt when one understands its cultural roots and tendencies. So that is where you can actually relate with the vulnerable situations, what are the underlying cultural dimension, what is holding that vulnerability, right? So that is where if you want to bridge that gap between the vulnerability and the capacity and the development, you need to look at the culture very much. In the conservation module, we talk about how to connect past, present and future. That is where we talk about continuity, the cultural continuity, and the preserve, how to preserve and how to protect the heritage, and how we can reconstruct. That is where we talked about the Taksim Square case and all other examples, post-war constructions as well. And sixth place, this is much more in operational terms, that is where in the planning of a city, in a city level, how one can think of. And not only that, how we can actually talks about the creative cities network, and how we can, because planning is a process, it's a process, it engages various stakeholders into it, various dimensions into it, and how planning to protect nature and to reintegrate humans and nature through culture. In the seventh module, materials, technology, open up choices, because there are a variety of materials, they open up choices in the present context. But you need to be very careful, especially when dealing in a cultural context. You need to learn to choose the appropriate one. And in the last module, we talked about the social change in the digital age, in the modernization, in the globalization, westernization, sanskritization. But what we need to address is how we can improve our abilities to adapt and to connect past, present, and the future. So this is all the journey so far. This is the overall understanding which we brought. As this is my very first course in culturally responsible environments, I'm definitely, the way you have learned, I also have learned many things, especially in some of the lacuna, what I need to develop myself, and as well as obviously your feedback will always be much more appreciated in what way I can develop further, so that I can tailor it further, I can prepare much better, and come up with a new developed course in future. And in fact, some of my understanding through this is, this culture is, I'm not getting any limit where to stop this subject. That is one of the important part. So that is where this will definitely continue in further courses, but your feedback will be much appreciated. And in fact, in somehow it has to also talk about, especially in terms of assignments, because it's an online course, you are giving some kind of multiple choice questions or any other thing. I would advise you and all of you, first understand, you have a camera, travel around, document it, have a logbook or a diary kind of thing. Start documenting what you see around you. Even if you are traveling in metro, start sketching out, start documenting what you see, what you observe. So all these narratives, all these performative observations will actually tell you a story, and will actually tell you the whole dynamic situation of this particular culturally responsive built environments. So this is and even you can practice the photography, travel around, start taking them nice photographs, and you can articulate. Even a small photograph have a very rich evidence into it. So this is what you need to work on. And the second thing which I would recommend is practice writing, how we can actually write the articles, and that is where it will help you further. And in fact, in your final examination also, probably we might come up with a kind of writing question as well. And so all the best for your examinations, and once again thank you very much for participating in this course, and I really wish you, all of you, very best, and I hopefully try to meet you in any of the way we can, and definitely we can take this subject further, and with you, all your efforts, interactions, it will definitely enrich our program. Thank you very much, and thank you NPTEL and IIT Roorkee for providing me this opportunity. Thank you.